All right, 111 historians, let's pick this back up. I think there's somewhere about still Unit 1. We're talking, I think I'm in the fourth one. We were talking about the evolution of man. We're talking about mitochondrial Eve. We talked about hominids, about Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo sapiens, and how it's Homo sapiens sapiens were related to. We talked about his transition along the edge of the continents, the expansion down into areas that are highly habitable. Folks, we chase the food because we're hungry people, and as the food migrates, so do we. We end up in areas along the ocean. Why? Because there's a lot of rivers that enter the ocean. They're a food source when it comes to the ocean. We've got lots of fish around there. Most of the areas along the edge of the ocean, as we get down to the temperate zones, as we get down to the equator, are highly habitable, and they have much longer growing seasons. So it's not a mystery that we end up in the Middle East. It's not a mystery that we end up in Central America. It's not a mystery that we end up in a lot of places that we do. And so that is about the transition of man. And this version of man, Homo sapiens, is more forward thinking, all right? And because he's more forward thinking, he's that version we know that left Africa and helps to change the face of the earth by becoming the surviving version of man. What you have to think about is, yes, we run into Cro-Magnon man, into Neanderthal man, so named because that's where we find them at, is Neander Valley. And that's what Atlatl is a valley. And so we find versions, and we find remains, we find cave paintings along the way. What you have to remember is we're exploring the Paleolithic era. Paleolithic. So paleo means old, lithic means stone. So we're looking at the old Stone Age. And when man is walking around hunting, gathering, when he's using stone tools, when he is using the eoliths, the liths, and the microliths, we're talking about the clans, about the small groups of hunter-gatherers. We're talking about this Paleolithic era. What you want to think about is a few things. This is when we start to develop customs. This is when we start to develop things like monogamy. Monogamy is a custom. Some folks say it's an outdated custom. What it is when it starts up is a means of survival. You get a provider rather than looking at a different version of things. So we kind of guarantee this species. Part of those customs we look at are whether they are patrilineal or matrilineal for the groups. Patrilineal means that it is led by a father and a male figure. Matrilineal is it's led by the females of the group along the way. This is when we start to see the evolution of religion. One of the earliest religions is animism. They still exist in a lot of Neolithic peoples today. We talk about the earth having spirits. We talk about the ground and the animals and the greater beings in such a way that we imbue them with spirits and with thoughts along the way. This is when we also start, as we change between ages, we start to see the rise of what we call megaliths. We've got the eolith, the dawnstone. We got the microlith, the small little bitty arrowheads and spears and things along that line. The megalith is when we start talking about some of those huge stone structures. And again, you start to think about certain areas of England and Europe. I'll let you figure out what I'm talking about, but it's important. We start to look at some of the transitions. The book talks about Beringia, and it talks about the area between North America and Asia, known as the Bering Strait. Well, it talks about Beringia and the fact that it's a transition point between the two continents, because when the ocean levels are low enough, Beringia is actually a wide open plain that connects the two continents. And so again, that's how we get from Asia to the North American continent, is by following the food sources. We know that works that way, but there's some discussion lately about when mankind comes from Europe to here, when he goes from Africa into Asia, when he goes from Africa into Europe, when he goes from Europe and Asia into here. They have had some foundings recently that perhaps it might have occurred up to 100,000 years more than they thought it did. Our findings are based on places like Monteverde, Chile. We start to look at Clovis, New Mexico. It talks about the Clovis technological complex. It talks about carbon-14 dating and stratigraphy. Stratigraphy, one of the best things you can look at is if you go and you look at places like the Grand Canyon, and you look at the far wall of the canyon itself, you'll see that there are several layers of earth, several layers of sediment that have been carved away. Well, what happens is we start to look at mankind, and we can dig down into stratifications, and we can look at the different ages and the different periods. We can also use carbon-14 dating, which is looking at the molecular breakdown of certain elements that say, okay, well, look, this is this old, or this transitioned at this point, or this is when this artifact is from in this time period, and we can do that. And the book talks about looking at a few people as it goes into, say, South America. It talks about Nahuatl and the Nahuatl people, and it talks about not the Aztecs, but it talks about the folks that are farther down around Chile at that particular point, and it talks about one of their tools. It talks about the Atlatl, and the Atlatl is interesting because we find different versions of that in different areas of the world, and what it is it's a stick with a notch in it way back here and a handle right up here, and what it does, it allows them to set a spear right up here in the crook of it, and as they throw, it levers up this way, and what it does, it extends the arm in such a way that it uses physics and the mechanics of the throwing action to extend farther. It can throw this spear farther. It can throw it harder. It means that the person throwing the spear doesn't have to get as close and risk life and limb. And it's interesting because we find those. And one of the places we find those is in Clovis and the Clovis Technological Complex. And the book talks about that because it is an important era and finding of early man, because what it does is it shows his transition of a very unique spearhead, a very unique way of forming certain spears and certain points that shows the evolution of his brain and the art of actually creating spears and the mechanics of creating a spearhead. And we can take this version of it because it's very unique and be able to track it in Mexico, be able to track it in certain areas of the mountains in South America, so we can talk about the transition of mankind itself. Now, in addition to that, the book talks further about a transition to the area that we call the Neolithic Era. Neolith. So neo being new, lithic being stone, and so we get into the new Stone Age. And what makes this huge is agriculture. Agriculture is that dividing point between the Paleolithic and the Neolithic. I don't want to talk about the Mesolithic because that's a middle era, but either old or new. And here it is. In the very beginning, women are cultivating crops. They're saying, well, listen, every time we come to this area, we end up eating this plant. Why don't we take some of these seeds and we'll plant it where we're at in this time of year. We'll plant it where we're at in this time of year. And that way it's always where we need it. It's not a big shift to go from this cultivation to this agriculture. We shift into there's a more sedentary group of people. We find a steady water source. We find habitable areas, and we start to plant crops. We start to plant crops, boom, that's a shift. Okay, that's a shift from this Paleolithic to the Neolithic. We start to plant, we become more sedentary, and we start to expand our groups. We start to expand to things like trade. We start to specialize. We start to form small villages and towns, and eventually we get into cities. The book talks about the Natufians, about Jericho, about Catalayuk, which are some of the earliest groups of people that form this Neolithic era. And this Neolithic era, folks, when you talk about the Neolithic era, I want you to think about the Bible, because the Bible is going to be occurring in that Neolithic era. The Old Testament is all about this Neolithic era, and it's about settling in the Middle East in an area that we know as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, an area that we know as the Middle East at this particular point, because again, it's in that highly habitable region, and it's when we make that shift into this Neolithic period where we start to grow crops, we start to raise livestock, that many of us quit being, okay, hunters, gatherers, and we shift to people that are farmers or pastoralists, and pastoralists are the ones that with the herds of sheep or herds of goats or things along that line. And so that's a different version. All right, I'm going to go ahead and cut you off here, and I will pick it up with with Chapter 2 next of Unit 1.